Hi everyone, my name is Balazs Korossy-Khayll, and I work for a company called BlackRock. So let me say a few words about myself before we get started. I have a strong interest in technology and industrial design, and perhaps that's why I enjoy working on user interfaces. I joined BlackRock 2 years ago when they opened their office in Budapest, Hungary, my hometown. And my team is building innovative solutions for sales and servicing. So it's an internal tool. And BlackRock is, as BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world, there's no shortage of challenges. Just to give you an idea, BlackRock manages $6 trillion worth of assets, but our platform, Aladdin, it's called Aladdin, which we sell to other companies, is managing more than $25 trillion. So our scale on the world is massive. But it's important that we development teams can be an independent and responsible units. And that enables us to experiment with new technology. I think, in these large financial companies, it's always a good thing that when you can adopt new technology, and on the front end, that's especially true. Because I guess there's more, maybe less security considerations compared to back-end parts. So today I'm going to talk about the Monorepo and our experience with it. Before that, I would like to recommend these 3 books if you haven't read them. These have nothing to do with computer science, but instead they are describing how the human brain works. And I'm a huge fan of that because in lack of a better way, the human brain is usually described as a machine. And so the first 2 books are describing how our brain works when we are awake. And the third one is dealing with what we do when we are asleep. And they're really interesting. Later on, I'm going to refer to some of the findings in these books. So today's agenda will look like this. First, I'm going to talk a bit about the technology and what it promises, and then the rest of the talk will be about what our experience was and what the problems were that we found out when adopting the Monorepo. So, on a fine sunny day like this, your heart is filled with hope. You're confident that you're making the right choice, but to validate that, you go to your fellow backend developers and say something like that. We've decided to adopt the Monorepo way, and do you think it's a good idea? They will look a bit weird. They'll say something like, "You're out of your mind, right? We just finished moving the monolith from monoliths. You're breaking up our monolith into microservices. It took 2 years, and you're saying you want to go to a Monorepo." Well, the words are very similar, right? And to some extent, they answer the same problem of how to efficiently share code between multiple independent parts of a larger system. However, the monolith usually is something that evolved organically to be one huge system. And on the other hand, the Monorepo is started from day one to be a collection of co-located but separated building blocks that are deployed into many different applications. They're independently deployed into many different applications. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to refer to these building blocks as libraries to be consistent with what the structure that Angular CLI is generating. Right, so this is how it looks like in real life. On the top there, you have multiple applications in the same repository, and then here are the libraries. So the applications are usually just there to give you the configuration, and they are just importing Angular modules that are down there in the libraries. This is what you see here is a simplified version of what we have, of course. And if you were there earlier today, Manfred Steyer's talk was a more in-depth discussion about how you should structure your code to be suitable for a monorepo. But I'm going to focus more on how multiple applications can reuse the code and show how to do that. Okay, so as you can see here in the libraries, there's this list page, which is both an Angular module and a library. And when I'm saying that these things are independent, I'm referring to this index.ts, which sits inside the src directory. And everything that is happening inside this library is kind of considered private, and the index.ts, what index.ts exports is the public interface of this library. Usually, it exports the module itself, the Angular module itself, but it can also export some other stuff as well. For example, a data model that is a pure TypeScript file. Okay, so you might say that there is already a solution to this problem, right? We can use the npm packages. But is that the right solution? So suppose your company is developing a number of web applications, and there's usually some common problems that you want to solve. Now, you can either find the solution as an npm package that already exists. On the right, you can see some examples. Or you don't find it, and then you start to develop it yourself. So on the x-axis, you see the number of downloads. It can be, in this case, it's low or high. Let's make it simple. And on the y-axis, you can see the cost of maintenance. Now, if the number of downloads, so the project using the library, the npm package is high, then it's worth making it an npm package. So there are some good examples here. The isArray is a famous one. It's just one line of code, so the cost of maintenance is low. And Webpack is another famous example. And Webpack is a more complex system, so the cost of maintenance is usually much higher with those. Now, the good thing about the public packages is that they have some core contributors, but they also have a community, and at least if nobody is touching them, it's open source, so you can always create a pull request. And eventually, it gets merged. On the other hand, where the number of downloads are low, that's usually the parts where your own company is developing. So a design system for your company might be a good example with a high cost of maintenance, and some code that you're just using between a few applications in your company has a low cost of maintenance. Let's say it's something simple that is reused. And the question is, is it worth having separate npm packages from these things? So let's look at a scenario, and I'm trying to be exaggerating a bit, but let's look at these three things. There is two applications, and then there is the design system, and they are all in separate Git repositories. And the design system is something that you publish as an internal npm package. And then the two applications are trying to use the design system. So I have here a couple of versions, and let's say that the design system is implementing a component that's long awaited in this version, the 1.3.0, and maybe it's a data grid. And application 1 waited long enough, so they implemented their own version. And they released it with this version, 1.5.0. Now, although design system was ready before that release, they already have been working quite a lot, so they decided not to include the one from the design system because the time was short and so on. But application 2, in their 2.0 version, did include the one from the design system. So you already have some inconsistencies between your applications. And although application 1 in this release, the 1.6, they can include the design system version, but this application, app 2, with their patch release here, they won't upgrade to the newest version, which is 1.3.1. So in 1.3.1, maybe the design system changed something to be more aligned with the company's design guide. And again, you have two applications which are using two different versions of the design system component, and there are differences between them. So as you can see, there's this problem of inconsistency, or when to upgrade to the next version. Maybe application 1 won't upgrade at all because they're fine with their own implementations, and then you have this problem: why do you have the design system if not everybody is using that? Of course, there's some other problems. So overhead of creating a separate Git repository and the continuous integration process and publishing it to the internal NPM repository. It's not really easy to develop an application together with the design system. So if the design system is changing and you want to see it reflected in your application, it's not that easy because you constantly have to import the new version from NPM. And the design system so the developers of the design system have to maintain different versions because different applications are using different versions. Okay, so how does a monorepo help with that? I'm going to use this example of an application that is very simple. It has a list of items, and then it can display the details for those items. So this application should work differently on desktop and on the phone, because on desktop, both these things are on the same page, and on the phone, there's a list page, and then there's a details page. So, I implemented a demo application, and I will give you the URL on GitHub for this application, so you can take a look at the code at the end of the presentation. And in this case, this demo application is using the SpaceX rocket launches and displays some details about them, and even the video, the webcast videos. It's a great resource if you want to go through the history of SpaceX. I also included a backend with, which is using a GraphQL endpoint to supply the data for the UI. It's not really necessary because I could have just used the SpaceX REST API, but to illustrate the point that you can have backend and then you can have a shared data model, I think it's good. So hopefully this pattern is familiar to everybody. We try to break our application up into container components and presentation components. Now, the presentation components are there to just render the data, and they communicate with inputs and outputs in Angular. And then the container components' responsibility is to get the data for the presentation components and kind of arrange the presentation components. Of course, you don't mix the container and presentation components. So once you switch from container to presentation, then all the presentation components will come. and there can be multiple container components as well. So if we try to apply this pattern to the sample application, we see that on the desktop, we have one combined page for the list and the details, and on the phone, we have two separate pages, so the list page and the details page. And if you take a look at this, you notice that actually the same colored things are the same things. And what you see here is that the black bubbles are the ones that are different between the desktop and the phone. So those things. So you can rearrange them to something like this. You have one application for the desktop and one application for the phone. Now, in the Monorepo, you can do that. And instead of having one responsive application, which you normally would do, you can have two different applications for the two different devices. You could even have one for tablets, because there might be some differences between the tablet and the desktop version as well. Okay, so what are the challenges of doing things like this? Just like with microservices, without the proper tooling and the proper mindset, the Monorepo can be more of a trouble than a help. And Angular CLI is already a great tool that allows you to have multiple applications and the libraries in one repository. But is that enough? And first, let's take a look at scaling. So there's two different use cases that you can have in your Monorepo. And so far, I have been talking about the case where you have multiple applications that you want to deploy from your Monorepo. But you can have a situation where you want to deploy multiple NPM packages. So that is something that Angular does, for example. If you think about the @Angular namespace in NPM, it's coming from one Monorepo. If you want to do something like this, then you might end up with multiple package JSON files in your repository. If it's just one, then you don't really have a problem. But if it's maybe 5 or 10, then it becomes a bit of a challenge to maintain them. And so there is a tool called Lerna, which is a nice tool that helps you manage multiple package JSONs in bulk. And it can do things, for example, like importing another Git repository into your repository with the full Git history. The main reason you want to do it is that you can issue this command, and then it will update all of your package JSONs and publish them all at once. You can even select the next version. Maybe it's a patch or a minor or major. So the more common problem, at least in my experience, is when you have multiple applications. So as I mentioned, you can introduce the server part as well, and then you have 3 applications. And in our case, we have many more applications, and you can potentially have hundreds of libraries in your Monorepo. So, how do you handle that much applications? What you kind of expect is that if you modify the combined list and details page, then you want to run the tests. And if you run the tests, you kind of expect the page itself to be tested and the application 1 to be tested. And then you kind of expect that application 1 will be built unless you're using some kind of an incremental build system, usually you want to run Webpack and slice up your application into different chunks, and that's done in one process. And we have experimented with a number of solutions. For example, we try to just fork the repository into as many repositories as applications we have, and then build their own CI process, which kind of defeats the purpose. But then there's a nice tool called NX, which helps you with a lot of these problems. It's developed by ex-Google people, and it sits on top of Angular CLI. And this dependency graph was actually produced by the tool itself. And the benefits of using it is that, for example, if you do a pull request, then you can, with the help of NX, figure out what needs to be tested based on the Git commits and what needs to be rebuilt again. And when you want to build multiple applications all at once because you're changing something that affects multiple things, it can do parallel builds, which is really useful. It also helps with scaffolding your components, and it's way smarter than Angular CLI. So it can configure your project to be tested with Jest instead of Jasmine. It can configure your project to be tested with end-to-end tested with Cypress, and so on. Recently, they started to support React and Nest.js on the backend as well. So it's a really handy tool. Okay, so next up, collaboration. So back when I studied computer science, one of my professors used to say, when it comes to applying the theory, unfortunately, there is no good examples. And at that time, I was confident that, computer science is still young and that will change in time. But now I know that actually he was right, because it's changing so fast that there's rarely a good example. So instead, what we need to do is rely on each other to figure out that in our situation, what is the best way to do things. So it's important to have the rules on the structure from day one in your monorepo, because doing some changes retrospectively to maybe 50-something libraries is not an easy thing. Now, we found out that the hard way, I guess, because we didn't really think about. We started with one application, and then we added another application, and then we kind of, they were related to the same application on different devices, but then we started to add another application, completely different application, and every time we did this, there were some changes that we needed to do to the structure. So I think the bad news is that you probably won't have the rules on day one, because it's hard to anticipate all the things that will happen to your monorepo and to your applications. So for reference, here's the structure that we are currently using. So under the libs, we have the application one desktop specific things, the phone specific things, and we have the application one shared components. And then there's application two for desktop and phone, and then we have shared libraries that are shared between applications. Now, application one could have one philosophy of doing things, and the application two can have another one. For example, application one might use NGRX, and an application two might use something different. For example, GraphQL or just plain old services to get the data. So we've kind of figured out that we want the presentation and container components in different directories, and and we even push down the Angular modules and the libraries to the lowest possible level. So, for example, the NGRX state can have multiple state definitions underneath it, and each one is a library with a separate index.ts. And that allows us to reuse this functionality in multiple parts of the application. So you might have a dashboard that shows a quick summary of something, and then you might have a separate page showing that same something, and you want to reuse the state definition. And by the way, most of these things apply to regular project as well, but in the monorepo, the stakes are much higher because there's more people working together. So in our monorepo, there's roughly 25 people working together, divided into three, 4 people teams. And it's very important to share the best practices within the team. We went through an evolution, but what we do right now is that we set aside some time on every Friday where we do demos to each other, and the way we figure out who needs to talk on these demos is that we're using the code reviews to the pull requests, and then when somebody is doing a code review and spots something that is different or that is a nice solution, then that person can nominate the author of the code to talk on Friday. And there's a lot of people talking. But it's important to share these things, because when you go and change something in a library, it's your responsibility to run the tests to everything that depends on it. And if you figure out that you broke something, then you need to fix it. So it's the other way around. With NPM packages, you just change your whatever library and put out the next version, and then you don't care about all the applications using it. Now in the monorepo, you do care about it, because if you break the tests, then you need to fix them. Okay, so the final thing that I want to talk about is how you need to think a bit differently with the monorepo. And suppose that your designer comes and says, well, I think it would be really nice if you could have these quick actions on the list items. So you can, on the phone, you can just swipe this item and it will reveal this hide button. But on the desktop, you don't swipe. So on the desktop, we should make it behave differently. Okay, so if this was just one application, just one responsive application, what you normally would do, and here I'm referring back to the books, you do what you're used to do. So if you write a lot of control structures to handle these situations, that's the first thing that comes into your mind. And if this was one application, that was probably a good idea. So you could introduce an input to this list item component that gets the device type, and based on the device type, you either do this or that. Not really nice. And in the monorepo, what you can do, since you have 2 different applications, is that you do a little bit better than that. So your goal is to not duplicate any components, and you don't really want to. So since in the touch interface, you need to import some libraries, for example, Hammer.js to handle the swipe gestures. But on the desktop, you don't need that. So you don't want to bundle unnecessary dependencies with the desktop version of the application. So a better way to do that is that you can duplicate only the module definition. So you can have a list desktop module. So if I go back here, you can have two versions of the module that defines this component. So you can have the desktop version and you can have the phone version. And the difference between them is that one imports the desktop version of the list item and the other one imports the touch version of the list item. So that way, with minimal change to kind of the configuration, you can solve the problem of not needing to duplicate the code, and you don't include the dependencies, the unnecessary dependencies with the desktop version. So it's a really good thing. Yeah, that's what I wanted to just tell you, and I challenge you to think every time you write control structures to implement different behavior, to think about whether you can do it better. Okay. Thank you. And is there any questions? Yes?
So if I would have a desktop application and a mobile applications, how would I implement the routing? Which application should be served?
So yeah, that's a good question. It depends, right? In our case, we have a wrapper around the phone application. So it's wrapped in a native wrapper. We're not using any of the popular ones. We're using the one that our company is developing. So we're wrapping the phone application, and you can install it as an application. So we don't have to deal with that. But you can implement something that redirects one application to the other. So you detect that the device is the phone, and then you redirect to the phone version. But that's a different problem. I think it's still worth doing, although the application startup time maybe will be a bit slower. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Done. Thank you.